I was too busy stuffing my face with popcorn and forgot to undo the thing.
That happens. Hello, everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I'm Chris Weave. I've got Lissa with me. Pat is off playing airline pilot. We exchanged some text messages earlier today. I'll let him tell the story about the Lord of the Rings themed flight plans or something like that, departure quarters, access quarters or something. It was in Atlanta. It was the Atlanta airport. But I'll let him tell that story because I can't get the details right. But
I know there's like a forest area that's got like some pretty cool lights and like leaves and things.
This was stuff that they send to the pilots, and it's how they name the corridors or something like that. But
I'm not surprised. My cousin worked at the airport for a while as air traffic control. So that tracks.
You know, there's at least one geek there.
Yeah.
I totally and completely can believe that. You know, I was going to say I like how when we start the countdown timer, it takes a while for it to decide, like, I want to go slow today, or I want to go.
Yeah, it's like it starts off slow and then it's like, okay, you do you, boo boo.
Yeah, so it's loads of fun though. How's your week been?
It's been all right. I'm getting ready to go on vacation, so fun things.
And that means you won't be here next week.
Yes.
And so the current plan is, I can't remember if I think when I asked him last, Pat didn't know if he was going to be here. My plan is to do the show. I don't know whether I'm going to be doing the show from my place here in Dayton, Ohio, or whether I'm going to be doing it from my brother's place, although my brother won't be there, but I may be in Des Moines. It sort of depends. I've got this big project going on at work, and it depends upon whether I can make it happen or not, whether I can finish in time to bother trying to go home for the weekend. I may kick it back and go the following.
Fair enough.
If the following weekend is the one, I think it's the weekend after that I can't go because I'll be at the Origins game fair. But so I see a lot of names that I recognize. So hi, Peter Gold. Hi, Michael Ware. I don't think I've seen Michael show up here in a while. So welcome back. I
feel like it has been a while for Michael to actually
or at least
be
he
here.
has been posting.
Yeah.
Some of you who are watching this through the Aries Studio channel may have noticed a long time attendee, audience member, fan, whatever you want to call them, Right Sublet was telling the story about he didn't quite tell the story about getting shot by a 45, but he did say
I need an explanation. Right.
Yeah, we need an explanation at some point, right? But he did say it's worse that the kidney stone was worse. Having done the kidney stone thing about this time last year was when I was like in the hardcore kidney stone portion of my 2021. I can say it really, really actually did suck.
I had a feeling it was active duty.
Yeah. So
hi, Izar.
So did somebody shoot you? Did they shoot you on purpose, or did you shoot you?
Yes, that is the question.
Are you going to take the fifth on this?
I'm assuming, since he specified active duty, was someone shot him.
My guess is
you never know.
My guess, if I had to put money on it, my guess would be an accidental discharge. I know of one instance where some gate guards were practicing their quick draws, and one of them accidentally, I think he shot himself.
Good job.
Oh, okay. Well, right. I'm glad that it wasn't as bad as it possibly could have been, especially given the caliber of that weapon. So I'm glad you're okay. I mean, I'm glad that you've been okay for the last 30 years or however long ago it was. So
So, yeah, it
yes, he
was
can't be 30
accidental
years. He's not that
discharge.
old. I'm sorry, what was that?
I said it looks like it was accidental discharge.
Yeah.
Short version: cleaning the quarterdeck side arm after too many hours. So, that'll do it.
That'll do it. That'll do it. So, well, I was going to continue the conversation that I had started last week. Oh, okay. Yeah, looks like everybody except me has been shot at least once.
Are we counting BB guns and airsofts?
I haven't even been shot with those. Spitwad is about the highest caliber thing I've been shot with.
Okay, I've been shot at with airsofts and a BB gun.
Yeah.
But my brother and I were also aggressive dumbasses sometimes. So.
My dad tells a story about when Grandpa Weave confiscated the BB guns because he and Uncle Harold would shoot each other with BB guns. And it was, I think, the second time one of them got hit in the face with a BB that he said, all right, that's it.
You'll shoot your eye out.
Yeah, he was really trying. So. This is worth throwing up. The sensation was impressive, but I did write an A paper about the experience a year later in my English comm class. That's great. Make your life experiences work for you.
It works.
So, all right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start. I put together a presentation. Let me throw it up here. Oh, there it goes. See Alyssa. She's still there behind the scenes. She's waving. So let's see. All right, so I still haven't gone through and got caught up in comments, and I've got some other paperwork. There's actually some paperwork that I try to do with this. Like I try to track every episode and whether we have a guest and what the topics were, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been doing that for like the last 50 episodes. And that's because I want to be able to find stuff. So I have to kind of index it, and I'm behind in all of that stuff. I'm doing a lot better, than I was before, because I think I told you last week about having some iron deficiency stuff just taking the wind out of my sails. So I'm doing a lot better, but it's still not back to where I was in terms of getting caught up anyway. So this is pretty much what I said last time. I'm going to do an Exordium book read along thing. I'm going to reread the series. I'm going to try to put it together into a presentation of the combat model in that series, because I really think it's a pretty cool combat model. It's gun kata in space. And if it's an opportunity for you guys to either decide that you want to see the spoilers in advance and decide whether you want to read the show or read the books, or you can read along and then hear it after the fact, or you can just skip it all together, which is an option you always have. And then also we're going to do the Babylon 5 watch along. We're getting closer and closer to that, because we're going to sometime in June, Pat and I haven't scheduled exactly when, but sometime in June, we're going to talk about space combat as we see in the first half of the first season of Babylon 5. So there's some very interesting details that Wright puts in here. And I look forward to talking with him about that. And the hurricane in the Atlantic and the battleship Iowa. That sounds like it could be fun. So, okay, so I've talked about this naval combat series. I did a little prelude. I did Harris Lanning, former president of the Naval War College back in the 1930s, and then had Fleet Command after that. And now I'm going to talk about Trent Hone, who's written a couple of things. These are all people that write stuff that I go back and I reread occasionally, because I think they're very important in understanding how naval combat works. And, there's stuff that you can learn from them. And then I take that stuff and I go and I think about science fiction combat. And, a lot of it doesn't apply. Yep, totally true. Doesn't apply. But by virtue of the fact that I go through and sort of try to wrap my head around how it works in the real world, it helps inform how to think about how it works in science fiction. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination saying you should just file off the serial numbers and make it just like, surface navies in space. I think that's exactly the wrong idea. But I also think that parts of those problems stay the same, and you can learn something about science fiction by understanding how the real world works, and you can see what is the same and what is different and what can be changed to make it work in a science fiction universe. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and I'm trying to go through that stuff. So that's basically what I just said. Here's basically the things I'm going to talk about. Everything through Trent Hone is naval combat stuff. The Martin Doherty thing is actually a Traveler supplement, but it's a very well done Traveler supplement. And Martin Doherty is a British defense analyst, so he actually has a clue on this stuff, or he writes it like a defense analyst would, which is exactly something that I tremendously appreciate. And then I'll probably also talk about some beyond visual range air combat stuff. As I said, I think these are excellent illustrations on how to think about naval combat. And I think it's something that I can add value to the conversation by I can bring this to you guys, and I can explain to you why I think it's an important, and hopefully you'll come away with a better appreciation for stuff. So, somebody specifically cited Learning War, which is the book-length version of Trent Hone's work that he did with his father, Tom Hone. I will admit I own the book and I haven't actually read it yet. I keep rereading the articles. I haven't read the book yet. So let's talk about Trent. Trent's an amateur historian of some note. He first started publishing close to 20 years ago now, maybe about 20 years ago now. The Evolution of Fleet Tactical Doctrine in the U.S. Navy, I actually read a draft of that. And the reason why I got to see a draft of it was because his dad, Thomas C. Hone, is a naval historian. He's worked at OpNav, and he's a former coworker of mine in two separate places. When I first started at the Center for Naval Analysis, he was there, and we overlapped at CNA for about a year. Didn't really work with him at CNA. But I occasionally run into him, and my colleague Mike Markowitz actually knew him a lot better than I did. And so a couple of times I listened to him and Mike have a conversation, basically is what happened. And then he left to go to the Naval War College. And then a few years later, I left to go to the Naval War College. And so we ran into each other up there. It was while I was at CNA that somehow I found out about this article that his son was working on. And so I got a chance to offer some comments on that article beforehand. So he is a amateur historian who works as a software developer in his day job. This differentiates him from Harris Lanning. Harris Lanning was a practitioner. He was a naval officer. He was a fleet commander. He was a very senior naval officer. And so he was, his work was as an analyst, as a fleet commander, as a guy who's actually putting together the tactics. Trent is a historian of that period. He's focused on the development of USN doctrine in the interwar period. In other words, he's focused on the time period where Harris Lanning was a player. In fact, he quotes Lanning in that first article. Those two articles together cover from 1922 through the end of the war. So there's a little bit different emphasis, and there's a little bit of overlap in the second article, but it really, the first article is pre-war, the 20 years before the war starts, and then the second article is really about what happened during the war. Okay, so next. You may recall this from last time, and I think even the time before. It's worth stopping by very carefully, or very briefly, that's the word I want, very briefly, just to talk about some of the salient differences real quick between surface navies in the early 20th century and Starfleet. Basically, it has to do with range of weapons and how fast the situation develops. Starships are very, very fast. Everything seems to develop very quickly. They have a very, very long range sensor, so they basically can They've got plenty of time to sort of move to figure out into whatever formation they need to be in, etc. There's no real surprises when it comes to them. But their weapons are relatively short range considering how fast they are. Exactly the opposite with surface ships. Lots of fog of war, relatively slow compared to the range of their weapons. It takes time for things to develop, and they really can't see everything that's around them. So that's really sort of the differences between the two. Okay. So why 1922? Why does Turnhone start in 1922? Why not do World War I? Why not start in 1918? Well, the answer is really the Washington Naval Treaty. And the effect that the Washington Naval Treaty has on the U.S. fleet. So this is sort of the scene setter for this discussion. The Washington Naval Treaty was in 1922, and February 24th, if I remember correctly, and it was the first of a complicated series of treaties that was designed to avoid a post-World War I naval arms race. There were some burgeoning signs that there was going to be a post-World War I naval arms race. Now, Germany wasn't a player, so the pre-World War I was Germany and Britain as the two main participants. There were some other people in there. The French played a little bit. We played a little bit, but it was mostly the British and the Germans. Germans taken out by the outcome of World War I. But it was really looking like there was going to be this three-way race between us and the Japanese and the Brits. Because even though we had been allies during the war, Britain was a power that was declining. We were a power that was expanding. We were rising. And there was some thought that there was an opportunity for tension between the two sides. And so everybody thought it would be a really good thing to have this, to have a naval treaty to limit building, etc. So there's a whole bunch of different pieces to that treaty. One was the famous 553 1.6 1.6 ratio. It's a little more complicated than that because there's a capital ship ratio and there's some tonnage limits, and then there's escorts and aircraft carriers, and they all have different ratios and different limits, etc. But that's essentially what it boils down to. The Brits and the US are the 5s, the Japanese are the 3, and 1.6 applies to the Italians and the French. Now, this caused a whole bunch of consternation in Japan because they felt they were being slighted. So where did those numbers come from? Okay, well, there's a couple of things there. One is that it was recognized that the U.S., who had a colonial possession in the Philippines, that there was a lot of likelihood that if there was going to be a war, it was going to be between us and the Japanese. There's a thought that said that for every 1,000 miles a ship travels, that the fleet travels, that it loses about 10% of its combat power. I think it works out to 10%. Maybe it's 5%. I can't remember. And the idea is that if with this ratio, it meant that when the U.S. fleet got into Philippine waters to fight the Japanese, they'd be about equal in combat power. So they didn't just make these numbers up. They were sort of based on some math that they had. So that's where they came up with that. Now, Admiral Yamamoto, his response when the Japanese, other members of the Japanese Navy and the Japanese government and Japanese civilians were upset by the fact that this was somehow dissing Japan, his response was, no, that's not the right way to think about this. This is not a limitation on Japan. This is a limitation on the U.S. Because if the U.S. wants to outproduce us, they can outproduce us. They can. I've been to Detroit. I've seen the oil fields in Texas. I've seen the car factories in Detroit, and they can outproduce us. And so this is a limit on the U.S. Now, the U.S. was not really inclined to go and build the fleet that it was authorized, but yeah, he's right about that. It's more of a limit on the U.S. than it was on the Japanese. If the Japanese really started racing and we decided we wanted to bury them, we would have. There were other provisions in the treaty, and included that Pacific Island fortifications were prohibited. There was a quid pro quo. We told the Brits, we will not sign unless you end the Anglo-Japanese alliance. I believe that was technically a don't renew the Anglo-Japanese alliance. People forget World War I, the Japanese were an ally of the Brits. There was even talk of sending a Japanese battleship division to fight in the Grand Fleet, be stationed with the Grand Fleet. So if you're into alternate history, ponder what happens if the Japanese actually honored that request. As it was, they said, we're kind of busy here, we don't have enough excess capacity. But what if they had decided to support the Grand Fleet, and as a result of that, the Brits said, we're going to stand by our Japanese ally in this, and if the U.S. has a problem with that, they can go pound sand. Wouldn't that make World War II look a lot more interesting? So, the treaty also promoted a bunch of weird ship designs, in that there were limitations, especially on cruisers. There were limitations on how big they could be and what their maximum armament can be. So you saw people that were building, you'd end up with these designs that the only reason these designs happen is because of the treaty limitations. And that's why, to some degree, you've got like heavy cruisers and light cruisers and this and that, and this type of cruiser and that type of cruiser, etc. And that gets enshrined in things like the science fiction game Starfire, where there's like 15 different kinds of cruisers. But, in the real world, those different kinds of ships frequently didn't exist at the same time period. You're talking about an evolution of designs. And then on top of that, sometimes they're artificially created by things like the Washington Naval Treaty, and they're not sui generis. They only happen because something sort of made them happen. And so that's one of the pitfalls of just taking the surface ship combat model and filing the serial numbers off and putting in space at the end and dumping it into your science fiction background. Now, what I'm going to focus on tonight for our purposes is the 10-year building holiday. Now, that was extended by the First and Second London Treaty, but there was this 10-year building holiday. There was a lot of ships were scrapped, and some of those that weren't scrapped were converted. That's how we ended up with not having battle cruisers, because we weren't allowed to build the battle cruisers, but we were able to convert them into aircraft carriers. So we got a couple of good aircraft carriers early on. And then there was tonnage limits for those who were going to build up to the limit. And so if you were below the limit, you were allowed to build up to the limit, and you could scrap stuff and build up to the limit, but you couldn't build beyond the limit for 10 years. As a result of this, the U.S. found itself with arguably an inferior fleet structure. We had a bunch of ships that were kind of old. We couldn't build the new stuff. We had built some stuff that we wanted to change, and we couldn't. And so we're kind of stuck with it, including not having any battle cruisers. And I'll explain why that's important in just a moment. And there's no way to correct this inferior fleet structure through new construction, because we weren't doing any new construction. So we modernized everything we could. So if you look at the range of the various ships of that time period, they usually have two sets of ranges for the guns. They'll have an early period range, and then they'll have a late period range. Some of the most recent ones were built with expanded elevation capability, but we actually went back and retrofitted a bunch of the ships with the ability to elevate their guns higher so they could shoot farther. This is in part because fire control got better. We developed a capability of hitting at longer range if we could have a gun that could shoot that far. And the main limitation on the gun wasn't the size of the shell, wasn't the size of the barrel. It was how high the gun could elevate, because you need to elevate to get extended range. So we modernized to the best we could, but there were still some limits to this, and we had to deal with those limits. Okay, so let's talk about Harris Lanning really quickly. There's a few things I want to emphasize from the previous talk we had about him, and that is that there's 4 distinct phases in the operations of a fleet going into battle. You have to sort of do the cruising and scouting piece. You concentrate your groups, and you prepare to deploy. There's the approach, they call that. There's the engagement, and then there's the follow-up. And so we came up with different formations for each of these and an ability to easily switch between them. There's usually an emphasis on the dominant form of combat, which in this time period was the gun line. Everybody came to the conclusion that the gun line is the important thing. And that doesn't say that airplanes and bombs and mines and torpedoes aren't important. In fact, landing specifically says they all have to work together. You need to coordinate your effort between your warship types with your different types of weapons, that no one could beat them all. But when you put them all together, the gun line takes precedent, and you use the others to support the gun line. And it's also worth pointing out that Lanning lied. And I'm going to highlight that going down here. But there's a few things that he said in his paper. He didn't so much lie as he left stuff out on purpose. And we're going to talk about that. Okay. I want to dispel a couple of myths right up front. These are myths about World War II. Should actually say World War II there. The first is that carriers made battleships obsolete. Well, first of all, not until actually World War II could you even credibly make that argument. And that's because there was a lot of increases in capabilities that took place right before the war. And so there was actually no reason to think that you could just get rid of battleships before the war. And I would argue not even then were they made obsolete. They just weren't. We spend a lot of time focused on the gun line. The fact that there weren't any major gun battles, with the exception of Jesse Oldendorf happening to plug the I think it's the San Bernardino Strait, if I remember correctly. I always get this one wrong. It might have been Surigao. I can't remember. In any event, Jesse Oldendorf managed to cap the Japanese or cross the Japanese T and did tremendous amounts of damage. He got really, really lucky in terms of being in the right place at the right time. Excellent deployment. Had his act together. Don't want to minimize the achievement. But the important thing is that during the early part of the war, we didn't want to have a battle line battle because we were going to lose, because a bunch of our fleet was resting in the mud at Pearl Harbor. And then once it got to the point where but we knew that a lot of our capability was going to come back, because those ships could be salvaged and put back into service. And we had stuff under construction, because we had started a big construction program when the naval treaties fell apart. So we were building new stuff. And so everybody knew, we knew, the Japanese knew, that the balance of power in terms of the gun line was going to shift from the Japanese to us. So early on, we didn't want to fight that battle because we would lose. And then we didn't want to fight it when it was 1-to-1, when it was sort of even. So it was only later that we really sort of wanted to seek them out. So there was this time period where we weren't really interested in getting into that fight and didn't have a whole lot of capability to do it. You had a couple of these weird instances, like Willis Lee taking 2 battleships, 4 destroyers, and I think 2 cruisers into Guadalcanal at night. And that was just really kind of insane, but that Halsey sent them because that's all he had. We were really sucking wind at that point, and he sent in Lee and battleships in what everybody at the time, doctrine said don't do that, and he did it because he needed to support the landings. So carriers didn't really make battleships obsolete. There was still a lot of focus on battleships. Just because they weren't needed doesn't mean they're obsolete, in the same way that just because we haven't used nuclear weapons doesn't mean that nuclear weapons don't have a role. The next myth, because battleships were sunk at Pearl Harbor, it forced the hidebound Black Shoe admirals to yada, 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 whatever. No. Most naval officers understood the importance of carriers. Lanning spends a lot of time talking about them. Now, he says, and this is in 1933, he says, we're not quite sure we think we know how to use them. We think you can do this. We think you can do that. They very much talked about using them in conjunction with the battle line. The idea was that you could do a carrier strike early on to sort of soften them up, and sort of you could do strikes during the battle to sort of confuse their line, et cetera, et cetera. They clearly didn't know how to use them yet, but they knew that airplanes were important. And my friend Mark Campbell in his master's thesis has convinced me that the question wasn't when and how they will achieve this potential, that it was when and how they will achieve the potential, not if. That everybody knew that at some point aircraft carriers were going to beat the bomb. The question is whether it was now or not. And that was really only answered not even at Pearl Harbor. Well, you can make the argument it was answered at Pearl Harbor, and I'll talk about that in the next bullet. World War II came along at just the right time. And by that, I mean, you had a dramatic increase in the capability of aircraft. So a lot of the fleet problems that were testing how you would use aircraft couldn't, they couldn't actually carry the bombs that they pretended to be carrying. They couldn't go for as long as they pretended to be going, right? They were carrying a 50-pound bomb 100 miles instead of carrying a 500-pound bomb 400 miles or 300 miles or whatever, because they were using it as surrogates because they didn't have that capability yet. And one of the reasons why Pearl Harbor was such a surprise was that nobody had demonstrated the capability to do what the Japanese did. Nobody had done a major strike. The Japanese sent in like 80 airplanes. The biggest strike until then had been like 5. It required a coordinated effort of multiple carriers to make that strike happen. Nobody had done it. The Japanese had never done it until September of 1941. And they didn't tell us. They didn't tell anybody they had done it. And so we didn't know they had done it. So, until you see a capability demonstrated, it's hard to predict whether they're there or not, especially since we knew that it was really, really hard to do. And in addition to that, there was a timing issue with regard to it happened at just the right time where radar was good enough to protect the aircraft carriers, but not so good that you could have radar-controlled guns that would just fire hose airplanes out of the sky. And also the proximity shell, which was developed during the war, if it had been in effect before the war, you could have ended up with a situation where one of two things would have happened. Either every strike that goes against the fleet gets fire hosed out of the sky, at which point it's like, yeah, we're not going to send any more guys off to their death. Or if you don't have radar and you don't have that capability, aircraft carriers are really vulnerable. They've got hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation gas, 200 octane gasoline. This is a fireworks factory ready to blow up. And so if you can't defend the aircraft carrier because you don't have radar, and you're constantly getting surprised by strikes, then it may be that you lose all your aircraft carriers early on and you fight it out the rest of it with the gun line. If this war had happened in 1950, it looks a lot different. If this war had happened in 1930, it looks a lot different. So, okay. So let's talk about doctrine. What's doctrine and why should we care? I'm kind of a doctrine geek. We're all geeks. We wouldn't be here at a show called Starfleet Tactical at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night if we weren't. But I'm really kind of a doctrine geek in addition to caring about phasers and warp cores and stuff. Doctrine serves 3 different purposes. It's getting everyone on the same page. So everybody, if you know the doctrine, you know what the other guy is going to do. And by the other guy, I mean the other guy who's like the guy in the ship next to you. Your fellow naval officers, your fellow naval captains. You know what he's going to do. You know what he's trained to do. You know how he's going to approach the problem. So you're getting everybody on the same page. You're taking the lessons learned and distributing them in a usable form. So basically, we fought the Battle of the Coral Sea, and they distill all that stuff down and they put it in doctrine, and then they hand the doctrine out to everybody and they say, okay, here's the new doctrine accordingly. And so it's a way of promulgating lessons learned to the fleet. And it also shifts the burden of developing tactics from the individual commanders to the fleet itself. It used to be that they said, okay, the fleet commander will come up with whatever plan he wants to come up with, and he'll basically promulgate his own doctrine to his force. That works great in peacetime, where you're assigned to a particular battleship division, and your ship is always in that battleship division, and you've worked with these guys for years, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't work when you're fighting the Japanese and the Navy is throwing in ships as fast as they can get, sometimes without even being able to do individual workups, let alone doing a workup with the rest of the squadron. And if you need to just sort of treat these pieces like they just plug and play, if you want to do that, you need to have doctrine at the fleet level so that everybody can be on the same page, so that when they show up, you don't have to explain to the guy what the system is. So the result of this is, as one of the doctrine documents itself says, it obviates the necessity for special instructions under ordinary circumstances and minimizes the necessity in extraordinary circumstances, right? So I don't need to tell you how to do day-to-day stuff. If it's something really, really wonky, I know you know the day-to-day stuff, so I don't have to, so I can be efficient in my speaking, or, I can send you a page instead of having to send you 30 pages worth of instructions. And it allows you to just plug and play forces. You can send them in and you know what they can do, and they know, like, you're in this position and you slot right in. So from that standpoint, doctrine is just as important as anything else about ships. And that applies whether you're talking about wet Navy ships or you're talking about starships in Star Trek or something else, right? Doctrine is an essential technology. That's the right way to think of it. Doctrine is a technology. It's just it's a procedural technology. It's not something you can, well, I guess you can hold it in your hand because you can print it out. But it's not like, it's not like holding a piece of armor. It's not like holding a shell. It's holding ideas, and ideas are very powerful. Okay, so I've got a couple of examples of doctrine that are copied straight out of U.S. Fleet 10A, which is a total and complete rewrite of U.S. Fleet 10, and it's heavily based on what I previously referred to as the PAC-10 thing, which came out of the Pacific Fleet. Basically, there was a group of naval officers that were given a very tiny piece, rewrite this tiny piece, and they rewrote the entire book. And this is the sort of thing, when I talk about doctrine, this is a direct quote. I didn't leave anything out. I didn't summarize. This is a direct quote. So like that last bit, selection of target sector organization. So it suggests that you should define 4 sectors, each of 100 degrees, so that they overlap a little bit, and that's how you track targets going in and out, and you assign guns to the various sectors, etc. And so that's how you sort of split up fire so that you don't get surprised on stuff. Here's another one. It's specifically talking about day surface actions at medium range. Now, it says less than 8,500 yards, which is not medium range according to some of the other stuff I've seen. And that's actually an interesting thing. I should go pull the thread on that. I think actually, you know what? I think this is actually, it's not all of USF 10. I think it's only the air defense portion of it. I think that's what's going on there, is that it's only part of it. So we're not talking about medium range for the big guns. We're talking about medium range for the small guns. So, it's basically telling you how to set up your radar, how to do your firing, how to do all this stuff. So everybody gets this document. Everybody's told to use this document. It's guidance. It's not mandatory, but it also represents the best practices. So if you're not going to use it, you should probably have a good reason to not use it. Okay, so let's take a step back and go back to thinking about the U.S. fleet in the interwar years. So remember the effects of the Washington Naval Treaty. We've got a fleet that's slow, and we've got no way to fix it because we can't build new ships. We certainly can't build battle cruisers. And so we've got this problem. Now, the conventional wisdom was, and Lanning sort of explains why this happens, right? The conventional wisdom is that you're going to end up with both fleets coming together and ending up parallel to each other. They want to be in a straight line. They each want to screw up the other guy's line, but they also don't want their line screwed up, and so they're fighting back and forth. And you should make the assumption that both sides are pretty smart about this sort of stuff. So the end result is you're probably going to end up in parallel lines. That was the default assumption. You're going to end up in parallel lines shooting at each other. This was it was the U.S. Navy believed that this is how the rest of the world thought it was going to play out, and they especially believed that this is how the Japanese thought it was going to play out. I don't know the details of why they thought that, but it turns out that they were correct. When we checked in the post-war era, when we went through their records, that's indeed exactly what the Japanese thought it was going to play out. It was believed that because of the importance of being able to cross the T or screw up the other guy's gun line or whatever, that everybody would want to put fast, powerful forces in the van, in the front, because then hopefully they can get ahead, and then they can do this, and they can force the other guy to maneuver, right? So the idea is that you can sort of cut them off at the pass. So you're going to put your fast forces in the van, fast, powerful forces. The problem for the U.S. is that it doesn't have any fast, powerful forces. Its fast forces are things like cruisers, they're not very powerful, and its powerful forces, the battleships, are not particularly fast. And the Washington Naval Treaty prevented them from really sort of solving that problem by just building new stuff. They could modernize the old stuff, but they couldn't really build new stuff. So what's the solution? The solution included several components. One was, okay, so it's going to be, it takes time to deploy, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to have to outthink these guys. And we're going to have to do it quickly. So we teach people to think fast. We emphasize speed of decision. We push the decision-making down to the lowest level, so you don't have to wait for your boss to tell you to do something. You've been told in doctrine that if X happens, you are authorized to do Y. And basically, it's like do Y at the opportune moment, and you teach people how to determine what the opportune moment is so they can go and do their thing. And so there are situations where the light force commander is told, don't wait for a signal from me, do your thing. You know how to do your thing. So they push decision-making down to the lowest level. They emphasize making fast decisions. That does not mean doing things quickly. It can mean doing things quickly. It means making a decision about what the right thing to do is and being prepared to do it at the right time. So we developed efficient cruising approach and battle formations to minimize the amount of maneuver we would have to do, which would have two effects. First of all, it allows us to complete those maneuvers faster, which means, if nothing else, we can wait longer if we need to, which has potential beneficial effects of throwing the other guy off, keeping him guessing as to what we're going to do. And it also means that once we do our maneuver and we're in our battle formation, we can keep our line nice and steady, because that leads to more effective gun power, is to keep the line nice and steady. We do other things like aerial spotting. We use airplanes to spot the fall of shot, which increases our range. We use director fire control and salvo firing and all things like that to improve our long range gunnery. And we make modifications to the ship as part of the modernization program to enable long range gunnery. And we expected that we would start opening fire at ranges beyond where the Japanese would be prepared to fight, that we would be fighting. We would open fire before they were prepared to open fire. Now, it turns out we were totally wrong about that. They were going to open fire at maximum range too. But that doesn't mean that this was a bad idea. This was a good idea. You want to start landing shots as early as possible. And last but not least, we made the decision that we were probably going to fight on a reciprocal course. So instead of doing this and ending up in parallel courses, we do the other way. And the reason why we'd want to do that is because if these guys have put their fast, powerful forces at the front and we go the other way, then their fast, powerful forces are out of the fight and maybe can't get back in the fight. And if they can get back in the fight, they're out of position because they're at the tail of the line when they would want them at the front of the line. And it opens up the possibility that we can cut off part of the enemy line and kill it. And now we've got a numeric superiority, and that gives us an advantage in the rest of the battle. So remember how I said that Lanning lied? That's where he lied. He didn't talk about that at all. If you go back and you read the Lanning articles, there is no mention whatsoever of the idea of thinking about doing a reciprocal course. We kept that very close held. We didn't tell the rest of the world we were thinking about it. We were practicing it in fleet problems. We tested it up the wazoo. We did war games up in Newport. We did all sorts of things. We didn't tell the rest of the world that's what we were thinking, because in fact, we even went so far that we would practice that when you were going to do a turn this way, you'd initially start a turn this way so that they'd see it. And it's like, oh, yep, see what he's doing? He's doing exactly what I thought he was going to do. And they order their turn and we come around. So make the other guy, give the other guy what he thinks he's going to see. And so that's a way of getting him to do the thing you want him to do. I see a lot of good questions that I'm going to come back to in the chat. Oh, and so here's how they did it. They had 8 different plans, sort of presets. They didn't necessarily use them, but there's instances of like Spruance just saying like, you know, we're just going to use the plan from the book, right? We could tweak it. We're just going to use a plan from the book. The plan from the book is good enough. Everybody knows the plan from a book. I can say use 1L, and everybody, I don't have to tell them, explain what it is. It's just use 1L, and that works. So they had 8 different plans for different ranges, and similar courses and reciprocal courses. And so they just had 8 default presets that were sort of the general presets. And then they also had some special plans here and there. All of them shared the idea that you'd have your gun line in the center, sort of gun lines in the center, and you'd have cruisers and destroyers on either side, with more of them at the front of the line than the back of the line. They were also very similar to that. These plans also included things like if you're going to do a torpedo attack, you do the torpedo attack with destroyers. You don't do it with cruisers. You keep the cruisers back to defend, and that's because then if you see cruisers coming at you, you know that they're bad guys and you can shoot them. So it's like if you segregate the different types of ships, then you can do some rudimentary identification just by, yeah, that's not a destroyer, that's a cruiser, so we know it's Japanese. Okay. So what did we learn from all this discussion? All right. So, because that's pretty much what I want to say about Trent stuff, the historic piece of it. So what do we learn from all this? Well, doctrine is a force multiplier. It makes you more effective. So doctrine is another technology. It's the technology of implementing ideas. It's the ideas about how you use all that fancy gear you bought, right? Everybody knows that if you're playing a game, you know, you can give all the advantages to one player, but if he's an idiot, you can beat him. There's a game that I'm actually doing for Chris Carlson called Sea Powers, that it's a project that I worked on years ago with Peter Pearl and Mike Markowitz at CNA. And it's funny because it's a pre-World War I naval arms race game, and the Brits have way more building capability. And people always look at it and go, well, the Brits are going to win, right? It's like, nope, they win about 1/4 of the time. There's 4 players, and the Brits win about 1/4 of the time, because it really comes down to how well you play stuff. And also the British capabilities, because it's easy to get seduced by the British capabilities. It has a tendency, the Brits usually build and fight like Brits did, right? They've got a lot of shipbuilding capabilities, so they don't go in for all the esoteric stuff. They go for the straight stick, you know, sort of run-of-the-mill stuff. Okay, so we also learned that you win battles and wars through planning your fighting, not just the fighting itself. So we planned all this stuff out when we went into battle, we had an idea about what we were going to do. And this isn't just like you have to have good tactics. It's you need to plan all that stuff in advance. Honor Harrington series is really, really good about that, right? You Honor Harrington, they come out of warp. They look at Honor looks at the display, at the tactical display, thinks about it for a second and says, Alpha 4, execute Alpha 4. And you've got a pre-planned response and everybody goes and does their thing. They're not just making it up on the fly. Babylon 5 is especially bad about that. They had a situation, I remember, where there's a pre-planned battle. This is like in season 3, I think, maybe season 4. They're in that war room. They've planned out the battle. They're going on the offensive. It's a pre-planned battle. They come through the gate, and you got Sheridan barking out, small ships cover big ships, blah, 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 blah. It's all this stuff. It should have been execute Alpha 4, right? Because most of what he said should have been doctrine. It should have been stuff that he didn't have to tell them, right? You should only have to give specific orders when it's, telling people exactly what to do when you want them to do something that isn't already in their playbook. You call plays, you don't explain the play. You just call the play from the playbook. So you should maximize your strengths, minimize your weaknesses, and think through the problem. Like I say there, I'm tempted to summarize this as don't be Klingons. That doesn't strike me as the way that Klingons think, right? But the U.S. Navy maximized its strengths. It had a very powerful gun line. They spent a lot of time working on long-range gunnery to make it work. They had a particularly good gun, the 16-inch gun. They decided on the 16-inch as being the optimal gun, and they ran with it. The Brits went with 14-inch guns because they were cheaper. We went with 16-inch because it let us do what we wanted to do, which was hit at long range. We knew we weren't going to have the speed. We had to hit at long range. And so we thought our way through the problem and maximized the things that we could maximize, that we wanted to maximize, and minimize the things that we wanted to minimize. Perceptions are important, right? We figured out how we thought everybody else thought this was going to work, and we worked to try to make sure that they kept that view, and we used it to our advantage. And finally, there's a saying that you hear the U.S. military say all the time, and there's a bunch of people in Russia right now who are learning the lesson, which is fight like you train, train like you fight. Now, do we do that? Not totally. Not totally. And that's because there's stuff that we would do in combat that is incredibly dangerous, that we have safety restrictions on. We don't clear the sea of all other traffic that you would expect wouldn't be there if it was a war zone. So frequently when we do exercises, you've got civilian traffic that's around, etc. But we make an effort to try to make our training as realistic as possible. We don't shoot real rounds at people because that would be bad, but we do try to make it as realistic as possible. And the Russians didn't do that, and how's that working out for them? Okay, so what do we see in Star Trek? Well, we don't really see this stuff in Star Trek. I said that last week with Landing. We don't see it here. Some of this stuff is left over from Landing. And in Star Trek, we see really fast deployments and redeployments. I mean, ships are just zooming all over the place. We don't really see them use formations in the same way that a surface combatant would use a formation, right? So occasionally you see wingmen, but you don't really see like, we position these guys here, we position these guys here, this is how we do cruising, this is how we do the approach to battle. You don't see stuff like that. And part of that is that they've got long-range sensors and speed of maneuver, so it's like they don't really need to think in terms of optimizing that stuff. They can sort of optimize it on the fly. That's, I think, being charitable. I think in reality, they just don't understand that stuff is potentially important. I would really like to be able to sit down. I don't think it will hold up. I don't think there's the data to do it. I'd really like to sit down and sort of try to figure out do a real tactical analysis on this, because I suspect they're seriously sub-optimizing a lot of stuff. Sometimes Starfleet officers will discuss tactics, but they never really discuss doctrine per se. Now, that having been said, I can make a really good argument that it's there, because They do seem to do a lot of things the same way, and you don't have to explain things like knocking down shields, et cetera, when you've got new guys join the formation. So I think that they're very procedurally oriented. If you look at the book of Sternbach and Okuda, you'll see that there's procedures for everything. They've thought that part through. Those are the sort of people that have doctrine. So I think it's actually there. There's at least effects that are consistent with it being there, maybe sometimes. Okay. So what do we see in other science fiction? Well, in visual media, we don't usually see this sort of stuff. Babylon 5, like I said, certainly doesn't have it. Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, I expect that it probably might be there in the background someplace. We never really see anything that I remember as being like a big enough fleet action where this stuff would come into play. But if you go back and you look at all the stuff that was there done by their retired Navy advisor, the guy that put together all those squadron breakdowns, et cetera, and all the mission descriptions, et cetera, that's a guy who probably somewhere there's some doctrine written for exactly how they go about doing it. I expect that it's there. It just never got published. Whether that actually informed the TV show or not, I don't know. Written science fiction is better about this frequently. Like I would say David Weber's Honor Harrington series definitely has doctrine in it. David has as much said so, and you can see it in how they do ship design and stuff like that, and the differences between the different navies. They have doctrine in there. Jack Campbell's Lost Fleet series is another really good example. Now, Jack his actual name is John Henry. John's a U.S. Naval Academy graduate, and he is a retired surface warfare officer, and he's fantastic when it comes to thinking through these things. He's very, very good, and so I fully expect that if he could be on the show and we could have a conversation about what doctrine looks like in that universe. In fact, I really want to get him on this show. I just haven't had the opportunity to sort of sit down and figure out how we do interviews. But that's on the list of things to do. So let's go back and take a quick look at a few of these. Let me turn that off and do a quick look about a few of these. Okay, going backwards. Logic's Finest says BSG 2005 and The Expanse use ships in specialized roles. Much better use of military advisors by the writers. Yeah, there's a lot of that. I would agree with that. They're much better about that stuff in some ways, in many ways. I don't think either one of those shows is perfect in this regard, but I'll give them high points. DeLon's got some stuff here that I'm going to wait until I get to the beginning of it and go back forward. Logic's Finest also says Star Trek writers make the ships act like fighters instead of as specialized vehicles. Yeah, they're not really very naval. They have wingmen and they swoop all over the place. And I don't think that it should be a goal to take a modern naval model and file the serial numbers off and add in space on the end and sort of like wedge it into place, right? That's not my point in bringing these things up. I do think, however, that you shouldn't just take an airplane model of that and do the same thing. I think that if you're trying to do this and you want to do it consistently, if you're trying to write something like this and you want to be consistent about it, you need to learn how to think about the problem and make something that applies to what you're doing. CJ Cherry does a really good job of that. Her ships, she's got carriers, they all have naval ranks, but that is not a Navy. It does not act like a Navy. It has it's a sui generis system. Those ships are not naval ships. They're not just something with the serial numbers filed off. So I think that's the right way to do it. Going back. Logic's Finest has got another one. Do I think Admiral Halsey was a good doctrine fighter or a good brawler? Meaning, did he try to slug it out with raw power instead of using doctrine, planning, etc.? No, they used a lot of planning. In fact, he and Spruance, he was 5th Fleet, Spruance was 3rd Fleet. They alternated back and forth so that they could plan the next campaign. And it was the same ships, right? So it would be Task Force 38 would become Task Force 58 when Halsey took over. And then they do the next operation. And so they did a lot of planning, and he understood what the doctrine was. And I think they all used the doctrine when they had the luxury of using the doctrine. I mean, there was a few places. So Guadalcanal, 1942 was a very critical year in that regard. And there were a lot of places where they were making it up as they went along. And that's because they just didn't have the forces, and they hadn't rewritten the doctrine yet. PAC 10 is 1943 or 44 development, like early 44, I think. Maybe it was late 43. And so that was because they had sort of realized that they had a pile of stuff, and everything was coming out in penny packets. And so you got this doctrine pub and this doctrine pub, etc. And there were so many of them that they were actually contradicting each other, because this one had been updated. You had an old one, a sort of kind of stale one, and a brand new one. And it's like, which one do you believe, right? Because this one is about a topic, specific to a particular topic. This one is about an older topic or a different topic, but they're clearly not compatible. Which one do you believe? Well, the answer was rewrite them, and so that you've got a book to go to. So if you need to use the book, there's a book to go to. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Last time Trent was back over at my house was about 5 years ago. His mom still lives around the corner. Damn, guys, we hung out since 3rd grade. That's cool. So I've exchanged emails with him. We're friends on Facebook and stuff like that. But I've never actually been in the same room with him. I know Tom. Haven't seen Tom in years, though. It's been 10 plus years since I haven't seen Tom, I think I've seen him once since I left the War College, and he's retired now. So, Chris Carlson knows Trent. John Parshall knows Trent. They run into each other. I haven't actually met him in person. So, okay. Oh, called him to come on, but no answer. I made the comment that John Parshall has only 2 flaws as a person, and that's he's not a science fiction guy and he's not a gamer guy. I was talking with Chris Carlson about whether I should go ahead and invite him on the show anyway. I'm not sure that he would know what to say. But I thought about, we're doing some historical stuff. It might make sense to have him on. And it also occurs to me it might make sense to try to have Trent on. And I actually do plan, if you want to do this, Dave, that'd be great. I was thinking that I would take the link to this show and send it to Trent to see what he had to think about it. Let's see. Yep, that's the PAC 10 I was referring to. After 1942 to learn in the first year of the war. I think that PAC 10 didn't come out, though, until it might have been in 43. It must have been in 43 then. Okay, so I scrolled back. Yes, Drakinifel did do a great episode about the Washington Naval Treaty on his channel. Okay. All right. Let's see. Sounds like some of you may have had some technical issues. I hope that all got sorted out. Everything on my end looked like it was doing okay. Lissa is giving me a thumbs up. Was there technical issues, Lissa?
Someone did have a technical issue, but it was a site error, not anything on our end.
Oh, okay. All right.
Because I pulled it up and double checked on YouTube.
Okay. Thank you. I think that was Bob. Let's see. So my brother Delon has a couple of interesting comments here. He says, so doctrine is kind of like most pro sports, especially American football. Yeah, it's like football. It's also like basketball, in that you'll have plays that take place as part of a designated fast break. And so the thing about football is they always call a play, right? Somebody calls a play. The coach sends a play in, or maybe, Omaha at the line of scrimmage, and a play gets called. And that's not to say that people don't improvise stuff, et cetera, but they're running patterns, et cetera. And given that a lot of times the quarterback is throwing the ball to a spot on the field that has no human being standing in it when he releases the ball, you have to kind of know where those things are going to go. Basketball, if you've ever played any basketball, and as Delon knows, I've played a tiny little bit of basketball, never really anything seriously organized, but I know enough about the sport to know that, like, if you're doing a fast break and you see the guy who's got the ball, there's still plays that they run. It's just they never have to call that play. You just know when X happens, you do Y, or that those are the options to do. And so there was a lot of that took place in here. It's like, I know that doctrine says when this happens, I can do this thing, right? I don't have to, I launch the attack. In fact, in some cases it said that if you found yourself in a situation where the battle line isn't quite formed yet, and their fast and powerful forces are closing in on you, it's like the light forces are told, you need to launch the attack now, right? Your default is, if you see this happening, don't wait for us to say, please go do this. Just do it, because you need to break up their battle line before they can muck with us. Yeah, Delon goes on to say, at least until the broken play, and then people should know what to do when things get broken. Yeah, and that's, sometimes it's just you're pedaling as fast as you can, but sometimes it's okay, there's an alternate idea here, right? You run into things like that, especially in following situations where it's like, do I follow the guy or not, right? He's retreating. Do I go after him or not? There's some very interesting stuff in that second Trent Hone article where I think that's it. I was reading some other stuff today too. I think it was in that one about whether you fight at night. Spruance had a couple of opportunities to fight at night, and he elected not to. And in fact, when at one point when he said or when Mark Mitchner sent a signal to Willis Lee, who would have commanded the night action, because it would have been a battle line action. Hey, should we fight at night? He said, no. I strongly suggest we not fight at night. And part of that is that if you're really if you're beating them in the daytime, why risk a night action? Because night actions are chaotic, and they're hard to control, et cetera, et cetera. And I can totally you don't give away your advantage and fight and let the other guy equalize the situation if you're beating him, right? You don't do that. And so there was Willis Lee didn't want to do that. This is the one thing that I disagree with Trent on this, is that Trent at some point says, okay, when Oldendorf goes and fights this night action, and he just cleans their clock, this is an indication of what might have been. It's like, okay, yeah, got it. He won the battle. He was in the right place at the right time. He had better situational awareness, and he was able to win the battle. But that doesn't mean that battle worked out perfectly for us. We rolled double sixes. Doesn't mean that it's always going to work out that way. And if you contrast that with November of 1942 and Washington and South Dakota versus Kirishima, in that I think we lost 2 destroyers. The other 2 destroyers that were part of that were badly damaged. I think if I remember correctly, we lost one of the 2 cruisers. South Dakota, well, on her very first outing, gets beaten up pretty bad and ends up in the shipyard. Washington is perfectly okay, but we lost like half the force, went to the bottom, and we lost one of the 2 battleships in the Pacific. I don't think we lost it for very long, but it took a pounding. And so, yeah, that was really kind of chaotic. And that could have turned out really, really badly. As it was, it turned out relatively well because Admiral Lee was fantastic, but it didn't have to. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, Delon says, I was thinking that football is a long series of very short battles with pre-established battle plans. Yeah, and that even goes farther than that. It's like, you know what your strengths and your weaknesses are, right? If you know that your guy has a good arm, if you know that your ground game is where you're at, you do the ground game, and then that has implications for clock management and all the rest of it. If you know that your quarterback has a good arm and you've got good receivers, and that's the way you're going to win, then that's how you approach problems. If you know your kicker can't hit the broadside of a barn, then you are more willing to risk it on fourth down than you are if your kicker can do well. If your kicker is Grammatica, you know that you can be in your own end zone and he can get the ball through the goalpost 50% of the time. So, okay, maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. Yeah, okay, let's go down here. Yeah, Wright says 3 out of the 4 destroyers were sunk in South Dakota was a soft kill. That sounds right. That sounds like what I remember. So there was a question about whether war colleges teach doctrine. Yes and no. So they used to. It used to be that if you look at the curricula of the Naval War College back in the 1930s, it was all about tactics and doctrine and stuff. They made the assumption that, like, if you were a battleship guy, you knew how to do the individual battleship piece. But in terms of like the fleet, it was all about tactics and doctrine. When I'm a 2008 graduate of the U.S. Naval War College, and it wasn't really about doctrine when I was there. I kind of wish it was. It was more about strategy. We had a strategy course. We had thinking about how to do stuff strategically. And it was about the operational level of war, both in terms of being able to think through how to do operations and in terms of the sort of stuff that you'd need to be on an operational staff. So like a theater staff. It was the theater level of war, right? Heavy on logistics, but it was about how do you sequence battles to get strategic effects. That's sort of the definition of operations. It's the sequencing of battles to get strategic effects. It's about campaign stuff. It's not just about the individual battles, though. It's things like doing the carrier raid on Formosa in preparation for the invasion of the Philippines, the Lady Gulf campaign. And part of that was, distracting them and taking forces out, doing what were called operational fires in other parts of the theater to prevent those forces from being moved into, the part that you're actually fighting over. So it's campaigns, but it's also thinking about how the rest of the world can intrude on your campaign and what you need to do to prevent that from happening. So, yeah. So, yeah. So, there's a couple of questions or a couple of comments here. South Dakota did get hit several times in this battle. She had a problem where she had her circuits set in serial rather than parallel, and so when one of the breakers tripped from the force of her own guns, they all did. So this sounds like a Bush League mistake, right? It's very, very important, though, to understand something really critical about that battle as far as South Dakota goes, and that was her workup. She had just gotten in theater. They had basically sent her out. I think she still had shipyard people on board when she went to Pearl Harbor. They were still doing work. She was a brand new ship. She had never had the opportunity to go and get her act together. So her shakedown cruise was fighting a night action. So it's easy to say that, they screwed up, but hey, it's a tough situation. I think they did pretty good considering that. Washington managed to hit on her first salvo, which is really pretty impressive. I one time saw a lecture from one of the gunnery guys on board Washington back when I was in graduate school in the 1980s. And this guy talked about how the gun boss on board that ship basically threw out the doctrine, threw out the book, because he didn't think it worked. And so he came up with his own ideas. And that's what they trained to, and they were able to hit on the first salvo. Now, some of that was luck, but some of that was skill, and the entire rest of the fleet adopted that particular set of procedures to make it work. They got enshrined in the doctrine later on. So it was really pretty fantastic. Now, wouldn't you all love to see something like that in Star Trek? I mean, we know that there's a piece of that's talked about in Sternbach and Okuda, right? It's not really ever mentioned in the show, but there's something in there that basically says that when the war is, when they go out and whenever they plug into a star base, one of the things they do is they sort of like totally download everything they're doing, and it affects all the procedures and stuff. You learn about, it's like, okay, Enterprise just came in and did a core dump, and how is that going to change our operating procedures now that we've got this information from Enterprise? So I think it's that every time basically that they plug in, they're basically getting a new program upload, right? The operating system on the Enterprise, all the combat doctrine, et cetera, is in the form of computer code, and it's changing all the time. And that begs the question of what exactly is Worf doing? I think that Worf is running a tactical decision aid. I don't think Worf is selecting individual things. Worf is being presented options, and he's optimizing the options. He's basically saying, these are the type of options I want to see from you, computer, and the computer's feeding those options. He's saying, okay, got it, got your input. Here's what I'm giving you back. So basically, it's like he is the head of the tactical department, and the entire rest of the department is the computer. So let's see. Let me take a look. Yeah. So this is an interesting little thing. Wright comments that South Dakota had the toughest armor protection in the engagement, and that should give her some credit. Yeah, she really did. You can, in broad terms, you can think of the North Carolina class, of which Washington was the second of the two-ship class. The North Carolina class was a relatively long ship, and they decided that it was sort of under-armored, so they sort of squished it down, and that became the South Dakota class. So they kept approximately the same displacement, but they shrunk it down. So all the armor got thicker when they scrunched it down. As a result of it, it wasn't quite so hydrodynamically capable. So that class was a little bit slower, still a fast battleship, but not quite as fast. And so when you took the South Dakota class and said, instead of keeping displacement the same, I'm going to keep protection the same, and I'm going to stretch it back out to make it hydrodynamically better, then that's how you got the Iowa class. So the Iowa class is basically North Carolina class speed, South Dakota class armor protection. It's actually a little faster than the North Carolinas. But that's basically what you get with the Iowa class. In addition to that, you get a 16-inch 50 naval rifle instead of the 16-inch 45s that you had on the other fast battleships of South Dakota and North Carolina classes. So it fired a different shell. It was a heavier shell, but the U.S. Navy had concluded a long time ago, we fired really, really large shells, really, really heavy shells, because we concluded we got better performance over a supersized, extra heavy 16-inch shell than we would if we went to an 18-inch gun. So that's one of the reasons why we were perfectly fine sticking around with the 16-inch gun. And you can make a really good argument that the 16-inch 50 on the Iowa class was better than the 18.1-inch guns on the Yamato, because the 16-inch 50 was a really hot gun, and the 18-inch gun on the Yamato, not a particularly good gun. So, oh well, I think that's about it. Let's see. I'm seeing if there's anything else. I think we're gonna call it there. Alyssa, I'm gonna bring you back on.
Alrighty.
So the good news is that I only went 20 minutes over.
You know what? You've definitely gone longer.
I've definitely gone longer, and at some point, I had originally thought that there was a better than even chance that this was going to be a two-parter, and at some point, I said, you know what, I'm just gonna make it long if I have to.
Yeah.
So I probably should have told you that in advance, because I don't want to wear out my welcome with my producer.
You're fine.
So one last thing I did want to mention that I hadn't mentioned earlier. That you know and I know, but I'm not sure everybody else knows, and that's that Crystal's mother passed away, because I think
yes,
after the last show.
It did. It happened this week. It happened on like Tuesday, Monday or Tuesday.
Yeah, I was very sorry to hear that. I sent her a little condolence message that, in retrospect, I'm not sure how it was necessarily interpreted. I made the observation that, having gone through that recently myself, my mother had Alzheimer's. I am very aware of the fact that if it's going to happen anyway, fast and peaceful is not a bad option.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that my family and my mother and I were all pretty lucky in that when she went downhill really fast.
Yeah.
So, but I hope she's doing well. I hope she's doing as well as can be expected.
Yeah.
So.
But yes, Crystal did lose her mother this week. So for those who don't know, just
it was posted on Facebook. This isn't anything that she hasn't said.
Yeah, she said it in public. So, if you happen to have her as a friend on Facebook or anything like that, and didn't happen to see the message, reach out, do the thing.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to add one last thing, because Rob just said something I want to comment on. That the Iowa was in some ways more like a battle cruiser, not armored against even her own guns, but to be able to be faster. Yeah, it's interesting. You can make a very good argument that Iowa was a battle cruiser. I kind of make the argument that as ship size got bigger and propulsion plants got bigger, and you got to the point where you were reaching the hydrodynamic limit on the hull, and hence you weren't really going to go much faster anyway, that you could kind of argue that battle cruisers and battleships had split apart, and they sort of came back together.
Yeah.
And so you didn't necessarily need that. Now, the Montana class was going to be like 4 knots slower, 5 knots slower, and it was going to have more guns and more armor. And so maybe that's a counter argument against it. Lanning also made the comment in his article that one of the reasons why battle cruisers went away is because they were difficult to coordinate with the rest of the force. You wanted them to sort of operate independently as a fast wing, but there's this real serious problem that they can sort of go off. If they go off and they do their own thing and they get too far away from the gun line, then somebody's going to come along and mug them. And you can get yourself in trouble because ships are relatively slow.
Yep. Not much you can do if a plane's coming at you.
And so that basically everybody had just said, it's too hard to coordinate these guys. Well, okay, except I don't buy that totally. And that's because you still had fast battleships. You still plan to use your, in the fleet problems we practiced. In fact, I think a fleet problem where Harris Landing was one of the commanders, they still had ships that sort of went off and functioned independently like that. Although it is worth noting that when California did that, she did get clobbered and sunk virtually. So there were still plans to use ships as sort of like as a fast wing.
Then I think it probably just has to, it comes down to the idea of, okay, well, if we've got a ship that does this as good or about as good and can fill the same role, why aren't we using that? And we cut down on how many different types of ships we have to produce, which means different types of parts we have to produce.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. Drakenefeld just did a one not too long ago on the Alaska class large cruisers, which some people call battle cruisers. At the Naval War College, we've got these ranging sticks that they were used in the game that we found them in an attic somewhere when they were sort of going through. One of the people there would go spelunking in these old spaces where they had dumped all this gaming stuff from back in the 1930s and such. And so there was these range sticks. They'd use them on the floor. You see them playing with the models on the floor. They'd have these giant sticks that were like 10 feet long. And they had them mounted, and somebody was saying like, well, what's that? Because I see, there's DD, there's BB, there was CB. And I said, oh, well, that's the Alaska class battle cruiser. It's like, oh, CB? It's like, yeah. They didn't use BC for it. They used CB, and they officially called it a large cruiser. And Drakenefeld argues that it's not really a battle cruiser because of how it was designed and, what design attributes and stuff. I disagree with it, with his analysis a tiny little bit, not because I think he's wrong about any of that stuff, but because I think that a battle cruiser is what somebody calls it. Mm-hmm. And so, like, if you look at the attributes of the German battle cruisers and you look at the attributes of the British battle cruisers pre-World War I, they clearly had similar but not identical missions. They had similar but not identical capabilities. They clearly had different ideas about what a battle cruiser is, but they both called them battle cruisers. So I think at some point they're whatever you want them to be. So, all right. Let's see. Dave G Sound says that he sent Trent Hone a message about this, and I think that's fantastic. I may send him one too. So I hope he watches it, and if he comes in the comments and tells you that I'm full of shit, then you should believe Trent. Unless he's talking about Star Trek, in which case maybe you should believe me. But if he's talking about his own work, then you should believe him. So, all right, I think let's call it a night. I think next week I'm going to try to do Karl Lautenschlager. He's got 2 articles. One is The Evolution of Naval Warfare, which a lot of it heavily influenced the thinking that I do in my history, hiding, and hydrodynamics talk, where I talk about how warfare sort of split and stuff like that. So you've all seen that talk a while ago. And then he also did one specifically called The Dreadnought Revolution Reconsidered, where he talks specifically about why were the British dreadnoughts revolutionary? What made them revolutionary? And his argument can be summarized as it wasn't the fact that it included those technologies. It's the fact that it was a systems integration thing. So
okay,
that all of the technologies involved had been around for, in some cases, a decade or more. It was when you put them all together that the magic happened. So
it's like, oh yeah, maybe we should have done this sooner.
So I suspect that since with Trent's stuff, it's really sort of one great big picture. With the Lautenschlager stuff, there's 2 very dramatically different articles. So it's probably going to end up being 2 pieces yet, but I'm not positive yet. So, all right, everybody, I think it's time to declare victory and get the hell out. So thank you very much, everybody. See you next week.
Bye. Well, I won't see you next week. I will see you the week after because my birthday is on Friday, so I am on vacation.
Have a happy birthday and a wonderful vacation.
I plan on it.
And you should live long and prosper.
Yeah, everyone live long and prosper. Bye.
Bye.